The nation designer of Europa Universalis 4, originally introduced with the Eldorado DLC, gives players the ability to create fully custom nations alongside the existing historical ones. It can be used to customize cosmetic aspects of a country, such as the name, flag, and map color, but also things that affect the actual gameplay, including the nation's starting territory and its national ideas. For the sake of game balance, most things that affect gameplay come with a cost of designer points. For example, every province you add to the nation has a cost, and any national ideas above the base level cost points as well. Overall, the more powerful you make the country, the more expensive it will be. By default, a custom nation is limited to a cost of 200 points or less, but this limit can be modified in the game options to be anywhere from 50 points at the hardest difficulty to 800 points at the easiest. Ever since the nation designer was first introduced, there has been a question that many players have pondered over. If you were to use the nation designer to recreate the historical nations of the base game, how many designer points would each of them cost? And what about the various national ideas? This is not a very simple question to answer, because not only would it be incredibly tedious to recreate by hand every single country or national idea set using the designer, but if you were to attempt it, you'd quickly realize that most of them are actually impossible to perfectly replicate, even when disregarding the purely cosmetic aspects. But after giving it some thought, I realized that while the in-game nation designer itself is too limited to pull this off, it is possible to take its basic rules and extrapolate them enough to cover the vast majority of historical nations and idea sets without outright inventing any new rules. So with this in mind, I decided to put together a little program that can sift through the game files, gather all the relevant data, and then calculate what I would argue is the most accurate approximation possible for what each country would cost according to the nation designer's rules. In this video, I will take you through the process of how I designed such a program, all the considerations I had to make when adapting the rules, and finally present you with the results I obtained. In the end, it turned out to be a much more interesting journey than I had originally anticipated, so I really hope you'll enjoy. When I started this project, I was basing it on version 1.36 of the game, which was the latest version at the time. But it ended up taking so long that 1.37 came out, and so I had to do some last-minute updates to account for the changes that came with that patch. But it was not made using all the DLC, since I don't own any DLC released after Leviathan. I don't think this should make much difference in most cases. There probably are at least some nations or national ideas whose designer costs would be a bit different if every DLC was used. Likewise, if I disabled some or all the DLC that I do own, that would likely have affected the results as well. So just keep in mind that the results I will obtain here represent this one particular configuration of the game. The features of the nation designer that may affect the cost of a custom nation are the provinces assigned to the nation, the national ideas, the starting ruler, heir, and consort, the government form and rank, and the technology group. For the structure of this video, I figured I would go over each of these aspects in turn and explain how I calculate a nation's designer cost in that area, and then finish off each section by ranking the top and bottom 10 nations, or whatever is applicable, in regards to that aspect. Then toward the end, I will put it all together and show the total scores of each country. To determine the designer cost of a historical nation in each of these categories, it's necessary to gather data from the game files, both data directly related to the nation itself and some supplementary data which is necessary for certain calculations. Most of the relevant data is found within the history files. Here, each country has its own file which begins by defining some default values for things like government form, primary culture, religion, and more. But after that, things get a bit more complicated, as most nation files then continue by listing a number of dates which contain further information. In order to determine what the actual state of a nation is at a given date, we have to analyze its history file from the top to bottom by first assigning the default values at the top, then looking at every date entry in succession and noting every variable that changes at that date. You keep working your way through these entries until you reach the last entry that occurs before the date you're interested in, even if you're only interested in the original start date in 1444, you still have to take these history entries into account because many nations have entries from before 1444, likely because they were ported over from EU3, where the earliest start date was 1399. The data for provinces work in a similar way, where each province has its own history file. The reason I'm explaining all this is because it will become relevant to how we calculate certain things later on, so just keep this in the back of your head. Out of the things that affect the designer cost of a nation, the simplest one to calculate is the government form, so let's start there. The designer lets you choose any Tier 1 government reform for your nation to start with. Each government reform has an explicitly defined cost that can be directly read from the game files. Many of the more basic reforms don't actually cost anything though, and a few even have a negative cost, while the more niche ones may cost as much as 200 points. Each government rank also has a specific cost, with duchy rank having a negative cost of -10, kingdom rank having a cost of 0, and empire rank costing 30 points. All we have to do here is look at the starting government reform and government rank of each country and then assign the corresponding costs. There is just one problem here. There are a handful of government reforms that are not allowed in the nation designer and so don't have any defined costs. However, each government reform has an equivalent legacy government form, which are the old government forms that will be used if you don't have the Dharma DLC active, and these do have defined costs for the nation designer. So in the few cases where a government reform isn't allowed by the nation designer, I simply use the cost for their legacy equivalent instead. With that explained, here are the top 10 nations ranked by the cost of their government forms and government ranks. Or rather, the top 15, since there are too many ties to fit within the top 10. At the very top of the list we have the Aztecs, who comes out ahead of everyone else at 90 points, 60 of which comes from their unique Aztec Empire government reform, which also grants them the Empire rank for 30 points. Fun fact though, the Aztecs only rose to this position in the latest patch as of the making of this video, as before then they only had the generic autocracy reform, along with the kingdom rank, both of which are worth 0 points. So a 90 point increase in a single patch ain't a bad upgrade. At second place we have Ethiopia, who also has the Empire rank, but their government reform is only worth 40 points, for a total of 70. In third place comes the Mamluks, who much like the Aztecs have a government reform worth 60 points, but they fall behind due to only having the kingdom rank. The next batch on the list all have 50 points, most of which comes as a combination of a government reform worth 60 points and the government rank of duchy, which subtracts 10 points. But Ashikaga stands out by having a government reform worth 50 points along with a point-neutral kingdom rank. The rest in this list are all tied at 40 points from various government reforms, except for the Timurids and Ming, who get 30 points from their empire rank and only 10 from their government reform. Meanwhile, the bottom list of nations by government cost must also exceed 10 places, since the very bottom is a 17-way tie between various countries that have the duchy rank along with government reforms that are worth -10 points, for a total of -20. Going beyond their bottom 17, there isn't much to say. It's just several successive piles of ties. So let's instead move on to talk about technology groups. The cost of technology groups is also fairly simple, but comes with a few caveats. Every tech group effectively has two possible costs, one which applies if the nation's capital is in the old world, i.e. Europe, Asia or Africa, and one which applies in the New World, i.e. North America, South America, and Oceania. The cost for each tech group can be read from this table, taken from the game's wiki. As you can see, most tech groups are entirely free if the nation is located in the Old World, with the exception of the Aboriginal and High American tech groups, which cost 50 and 75 points respectively, no matter which continent you're on. Most of the others have a cost of either 50 or 75 points in the New World, except for the groups native to the Americas, which are free no matter what. The distinction between continents means we need to look not only at each country's assigned tech group, but also at which continent their capital is on, in order to determine the designer cost. However, in practice, the vast majority of countries just end up with a cost of 0, since the only New World nations that belong to a tech group whose cost is higher in the New World are a handful of Pacific Island nations with the Polynesian tech group, which costs them 50 points. Other than that, there are the Aboriginal natives in Australia whose tech group always costs 50, but the rest of the world gets their tech groups for free. Since that already covers everything there is to say about the cost of tech groups, I don't think there is much point in doing a top 10 list, so I'll just leave it at that. Now that we've covered the simple stuff, let's move on to something a bit more intricate and look at provinces. The cost of each province is decided by this formula. First, you take the sum of the 3 types of development, i.e. base tax, production, and manpower, and divide by 2. Then you multiply this by a factor depending on the province's terrain, according to this table. And if the capital of the custom nation is part of the HRE, then you further multiply by 1.2. If the province is the capital and is part of the HRE, then you add a flat plus 20 points to the cost. Note that these 20 points only apply to the capital province itself, whereas the 1.2 multiplier applies to every province, as long as the capital is in the HRE. If the province happens to be producing gold as its trade good, then you add on the base production times 3 on top of everything else. Note that gold is the only trade good that affects the cost. Finally, there are some provinces that have an explicitly defined extra cost found in their history file, and if so, that cost gets added as well. This extra cost is usually added to provinces that have some kind of bonus modifier, such as a center of trade, but the modifier itself doesn't directly affect the cost, only the explicitly defined extra cost does. So, that's the whole formula. However, there is a small quirk to this that we need to take into account, and it's actually something I had no idea about before I started working on this project. To demonstrate, let's take a look at the province of Stockholm. While in the game lobby, if you switch to development map mode and check the province's development, you'll see that it has a total development of 13, with 5 of that being made up of base tax. But if you load into the game proper and then check the development again, you might be surprised to find that it has suddenly jumped up to 14, with 6 base tax. What is going on here? Well, to answer that, we have to look at the history files. In the province history files, there are 2 commands that can affect base tax. One is simply called base tax, while the other is called add base tax. You might expect that these 2 would affect the same underlying variable, but as it turns out, they actually work independently from one another, effectively tracking 2 separate variables which are only added together right as you load into a new game. This can be observed if we look at Stockholm. We first set the base tax variable to 5. Then in 1436, the add base tax variable, which starts at 0, is increased to 1, which should put the total base tax at 6. If we go further forward through history, we then increase the add base tax variable by another 2, for a total of 3, on November 12, 1444, which should put the total at 8. But then finally in 1617, the base tax variable is set to 6, which should reset all the earlier changes so the total becomes exactly 6. But if we set the date to 1617 in-game and start up a new campaign, we see that the base tax is in fact 9. This is because only the base tax variable was reset to 6 in the 1617 entry, while the add base tax variable was unaffected and still retained its value of 3. Thus, when these 2 variables are added together upon loading into the game, the total is 6 plus 3 equals 9. This separation of variables also explains the discrepancy between the development seen in the lobby and that seen in-game. That's why in the original start date, Stockholm's base tax in the lobby is 5, while in-game it is 6. This brings me to why this is relevant to us now. When calculating the nation designer cost of a province, only the development seen in the lobby, i.e. the one for the base tax variable, matters. So although Stockholm's actual development in-game is 14, its cost is calculated as if its development was just 13. This means we have to be careful about separating between these two variables when calculating the cost of a province. This also means that any province whose history file includes the add base tax command effectively receives a hidden buff when it comes to the nation designer. With that in mind, which provinces besides Stockholm benefit from this? Well, none. As it turns out, Stockholm is literally the only province in the entire game whose history file makes use of the add base tax command. And in case you're wondering, no, there are no provinces that use the add base production or add base manpower commands either. So in conclusion, I went through all the trouble of dealing with this weird quirk only for it to occur exactly once in the whole game and otherwise be completely irrelevant. So that's cool. Alright, with that out of the way, most of the other elements in the formula are fairly straightforward. Whether the province is a country's capital or not can be read from that country's history file, and whether the capital province is part of the HRE is found in the province's history file, as is the province's trade good and any hard-coded extra cost. That just leaves the terrain, which, as it turns out, is by far the most complicated thing to determine out of all the relevant province data. Actually, out of all relevant data for this entire project. Seriously. The full explanation for how the game decides what terrain a province should have is far too long-winded and complex for me to bother explaining here. But if you're interested, you can read all about it in this excellent blog post by Komaguchi, the developer of the EU4 save game analysis tool Rockally. It's a bit technical, but it is nonetheless a very interesting read. I'll link it in the description if you want to check it out. As for me, I initially spent a good couple of hours trying to sort out all this madness before I realized there was a simpler way. Just load into the game, switch to the simplified terrain map mode, and then take a map shot. This gave me a clean image where every province is filled in with one color each, and each color corresponds to one specific terrain type. Parsing through this image to record the terrain type of every province still required a bit of technical fiddling, but was far easier than doing it the quote-unquote proper way. So, we now know how to calculate the cost of each province that a nation owns, but that still leaves some ambiguous cases. First, what do we do about nations with vassals or other subject types? The nation designer doesn't allow you to directly add subjects to a custom nation. However, there actually is a way to take the countries that already are subjects of historical nations and give them to a custom nation. All you have to do is give every province belonging to the original overlord to your custom nation, so that you effectively annex them. Then when you load into the game, you'll find that all the subjects of the original overlord now belong to the new nation instead. This means that it's entirely possible to recreate historical nations with subjects in the nation designer, and the subjects don't add any additional designer cost to their new overlord. However, while this works for most subject types, it unfortunately does not seem to work for personal unions. I can't really see a way around that though, so for the purposes of this project, I will treat personal unions the same as the other subject types in regards to the designer cost of the senior partner. That is, they won't add any additional cost. Another tricky case has to do with the tribal land belonging to many native tribes in America and Australia. In the game files, these are assigned to various countries as their own separate thing from directly held provinces. But in the nation designer, you can only add directly held provinces. Or at least it seems that way at first. But as it turns out, if you create a custom nation with a native government type that normally uses tribal land and give it a bunch of provinces, then once you load into the game, all provinces except their capital will automatically become tribal land. So for the historical nations that own tribal land, we can simply count the cost of those provinces exactly the same as if they had been regular provinces. That's all there is to say about how to calculate the designer cost of provinces. So let's now have a look at the top 10 most expensive provinces in the game. For this list, we'll be looking at the provinces in a vacuum, so to speak. That means we won't include any cost modifiers that depend on the country that owns the provinces, such as whether the country is a member of the HRE. Topping the list we have Canton. which comes out significantly ahead of the rest at 48 points, while the next contenders, Constantinople and London, are tied at 36.5. As we can see, all the top 10 provinces have fairly high development, but they're not necessarily among the highest development provinces in the world. Rather, most of them get the lion's share of their cost from the extra cost variable, which is typically tied to province modifiers. Canton has the highest extra cost in the game, at 34, which they presumably were given due to having both a level 3 center of trade and a Pearl estuary. And overall, the top 10 most expensive provinces also happen to have the top 10 largest extra cost variables, with one exception. The province of Mexico doesn't have a very large extra cost, nor does it have a particularly high development, but what it does have is gold. As explained earlier, gold provinces get an extra 3 points in cost for every one base production, and Mexico happens to have the highest base production of all gold producing provinces, at 7, giving them 21 points of cost from their gold alone. As for the bottom 10 provinces, we once again run into the problem of every spot on the list being tied by at least 10 different provinces, and often more. So to make this bottom list a bit more meaningful, I will abandon the constraint of looking at a specific number of individual provinces and instead explain what features each group of provinces near the bottom have in common. The very cheapest provinces in the game have a total cost of 1.125, which is a result of having the lowest possible development of 3 combined with either mountains or glacier terrain, which both have a 0.25 cost multiplier, and no other modifiers from things like gold or extra cost variables. The second cheapest provinces also have free development, but their terrain is either desert or jungle, which has a cost multiplier of 0.8, resulting in a total cost of 1.2. This pattern of free development and gradually better terrain types continues up until the 6th cheapest group of provinces. The total cost of each of these provinces is 1.5, but they can get this either by having free development and the grasslands terrain, or by having 2 development and either the mountains or glacier terrain. After that, the next few spots continue at 2 development and with gradually better terrain types, before we again start to see a mix of provinces with lower development but better terrain, and provinces with higher development but worse terrain. In case you're wondering, we have to go all the way to the 2250th worst province before gold or extra cost variables start to play a role. Before that, it's only terrain and development that matters. Now that we looked at the top and bottom entries for the provinces themselves, we can move on to look at which countries come out on top or bottom when it comes to the total cost of all provinces in their possession. The number 1 spot should come as no surprise. Ming is indisputably the top dog in terms of province cost, sitting almost 500 points ahead of second place, which is England. After that, there's a more gradual decline, with only a 100 points difference between number 2 and number 10. If we compare this to total development, we can see that it doesn't quite follow the same trend, as some countries have higher development but still lower cost. That's usually because of province modifiers, such as trade centers, which motivates giving extra costs to certain provinces. This explains why, for example, Mamluks has a slightly higher province cost than Ottomans, despite falling almost 80 dev short. Their province modifiers gives them over 40 points more in extra costs, while each point of development only contributes half a point, so these 2 costs cancel each other out in this case. The distribution of terrain modifiers can also have an impact, as depending on terrain, the development cost of a province can be altered by anything from 75% to 105%. The bottom list of countries in terms of territorial cost is just a long series of one province minors whose ranking on the list comes down entirely to the cost of their one province. As such, anything I could say here will just be a rehash of the bottom list for the provinces themselves, so I'm not going to bother. With provinces done, it's now time to move on to the next item on our list, namely the court. A custom nation must start with a ruler and can optionally start with an heir and a consort as well. These cost points based on their skills and personality traits, and in the case of rulers and heirs, their age plays a role as well. The cost of the ruler is decided by the following formula. You first take the sum of their skills, then subtract 6, then multiply by 2. Then you add on the cost of their personality traits, then multiply all of that by a factor of 30 divided by their age. Each personality trait has a defined cost, where most positive traits cost either 2 or 5 points, but a few cost as much as 10 or 30, and then there's the immortal trait, which costs 800 points all on its own. But obviously no historical ruler has this trait. Negative traits all cost minus 2 points, and finally you can choose to have randomized traits, which cost nothing at all. The implications of this formula is that a ruler with a sum of skills above 6 or with positive personality traits will have a positive cost, while a ruler with skills below 6 or with negative traits will have a negative cost, and the age factor serves to amplify the cost for younger rulers. So a bad young ruler will have a large negative cost, and a good young ruler will have a large positive cost, while the cost of old rulers tends towards 0 either way. The formula for heirs look very similar, with the only difference being the age factor, where you add a flat plus 15 to their age before dividing. Consorts meanwhile use the same formula for skills and personality traits, but their age doesn't matter. Instead, they multiply everything by a fixed factor of 1/4. There are several considerations that must be made when calculating the cost of historical rulers, heirs, and consorts. First, in the nation designer, a ruler can only be assigned an age between 20 and 40 years, and the same goes for consorts, while an heir must have an age between 0 and 30 years. But for the historical nations, there are no such restrictions, as rulers, heirs, and consorts can technically be of any age. This doesn't matter much to us though, as the formulas can be applied just as well to ages outside of the nation designer's limits. The only exception is if a ruler should happen to have an age below 1 year old, since that would result in a division by 0, which isn't allowed. Fortunately, no historical ruler starts with an age of 0, so we don't have to worry about it. For many countries, deciding the cost of the rulers is fairly straightforward, as you can find all relevant data about them in the history files. But for many others, the majority in fact, things get a bit more complicated. First, there are a handful of nations that start the game without a proper ruler, instead being led by regency councils, queen regencies, or an interregnum. It's not possible to create such starting conditions in the nation designer, so how do we deal with them? Well, by looking in the game files, we can find that both regency councils and interregnums are defined as regular monarchs, only with the regent variable set to yes, so there is no reason we can't just calculate their cost as we would a regular ruler. Queen regencies meanwhile have a special tag called monarch consort, but in-game they act essentially the same as a proper ruler, so I think it's fair to calculate their cost as a ruler as well. But that's just the beginning. Things get truly interesting when we look at randomized rulers. You may or may not have noticed that not all starting rulers appear completely consistent every time you start a new game. Most rulers have randomized personality traits. But more significantly, many rulers also have randomized ages, and some even have randomized skills. There are two scenarios in which a ruler will have both random age and random skills. The first is if there is no ruler defined within the nation's history file prior to the start date. This is the case for only a handful of nations, including Blambangan, Banjar, and the Maori nations of New Zealand. The second scenario is if you have a nation with either a republican, theocratic, or native government form, and whose ruler is designated as a regent. In these cases, the regency will be immediately replaced by a completely new randomized ruler when you start the game. Far more common than completely random rulers though, are rulers where only their age is random. Normally, a ruler's age is determined by taking the difference in time between their designated birth date and the start date. But many rulers don't have a designated birth date, and so their age is randomized upon game start. Or more accurately, it's semi-randomized. There is always a minimum and maximum age that a ruler may be generated with, but what those ages are depends on two things: the government form of the country they rule, and the date at which they are defined in the history file. For countries whose governments are monarchies, tribals, or natives, the age of rulers without a defined birth date is equal to the time difference between the date they are defined and the start date, plus 18 to 21. So a ruler that is defined in 1444 will have a random age within the range of 18 to 21 years. A ruler that is defined in 1424, meanwhile, will have an age within the range of 38 to 41 years. Republics and theocracies follow a similar principle, except their rulers have a much greater age range. Their age is equal to the time difference between the definition date and the start date, plus 30 to 59. So a ruler defined in 1444 can be anywhere from 30 to 59 years, and so on. These formulas hold true for regular rulers as well as consort regencies, but if the ruler is designated as a regent without being a consort, then things are a bit different. For republics, theocracies, and natives, the definition date doesn't matter in this case, and instead the ruler will always have an age within a fixed range no matter what, that range being 30 to 59 for theocracies and republics, and 18 to 21 for natives. For the other government forms though, the definition date does matter the same as before, but the age range is strangely different, being between 45 and 59 years instead of 18 to 21. When it comes to rulers with randomized skills though, it's thankfully a lot more simple. Their skills may end up as anything from 000 to 666. Interesting to note is that regencies in republics, theocracies and natives can have skills explicitly defined in the game files, but those will be ignored when a ruler is generated upon game start, and instead all skills will be randomized anyway. So, now that we know when and how certain rulers may be randomized, how do we deal with this fact when trying to calculate nation designer costs? Well, for random personality traits, it's fortunately rather easy, as the nation designer already allows you to assign random traits for no cost, so we can safely ignore them. But there is no such random option for ages and skills, so what I decided to do was to calculate two different costs for any randomized or partially randomized ruler. One for the cheapest possible stats that a ruler may have, and one for the most expensive. That way we can at least get the full range of possible costs for any nation with a randomized ruler, in lieu of one definitive cost. For rulers with both randomized skills and randomized ages, the cheapest version would be a ruler with skills of 000 and the lowest age allowed by its government form, while the most expensive version would have skills of 666 and also have the lowest allowed age. Remember that the age modifier serves as an amplifier of the base cost, whether it's positive or negative, so a younger age will lead to both a higher maximum cost and a lower minimum cost. For rulers with fixed skills but randomized ages though, the age that gives the cheapest versus most expensive cost depends on whether the sum of skills are above or below 6. If it's above, then the cheapest version will have the highest age possible to minimize the positive cost, while the most expensive version will have the lowest age in order to maximize the positive cost. If the sum of skills is below 6, then the reverse is true, with the cheapest version having a low age and the most expensive version having a high age. With that, there's only one more thing we need to talk about regarding rulers, and that's personal unions. Personal union means that two or more countries share the same ruler, so to calculate the cost for the junior partner, we just need to copy over the ruler from the senior partner. Personal unions are not defined within the history files of the countries themselves. Rather, there are separate history files for diplomatic pacts, which we'll have to parse through to find them. These files define the senior and junior partner and also the historical start and end dates for the union. So all I did was to check for any union which would have been active in the year 1444 and simply replaced any ruler the junior partner may have been assigned in their own history file with a copy of the current ruler of the senior partner. After that, I just treat the copied ruler like any other. With that, we're finally ready to talk about the top and bottom rulers in terms of designer cost. Here, the list is topped by the Ottoman ruler Mehmed II, who scores no less than 55 points. This is of course owing to his very high skills of 646, but also because he's only 12 years old at the start, which gives him an age multiplier of 2.5. This is not only 8 years younger than the youngest age a ruler can be given in the Nation Designer, but it's also 3 years younger than what a ruler can even be under normal circumstances. So yeah, safe to say this guy is a bit overpowered. The number 2 spot on the list of rulers is actually a tie though. Specifically, it's a 127-way tie. Sort of. What this represents is the maximum cost of any ruler where both their skills and age are randomized, which ends up being an 18-year-old with skills of 666. This results in a cost of 40, which falls short of Mehmed's 55 due to the latter's exceptionally young age. There are 127 nations with fully randomized rulers like this, which is why the number 2 spot is tied by so many. But to make things more interesting, let's exclude these fully randomized rulers and instead look only at rulers with fixed skills. Most of these still have randomized ages, which means we'll have to distinguish between their cheapest versus most expensive versions. But the difference between the two isn't nearly as great as with the fully randomized rulers. With that, the list instead looks like this. Second place is Noritada of Uesigi, who falls behind Mehmed by quite a bit. This is despite the fact that Noritada is actually even younger than Mehmed, being only 11 years old in 1444. But his skills, while still respectable, nonetheless fall a bit short of the Ottoman ruler. Third place is a tie between Moctezuma of the Aztecs and Yemelai of Perm, at 30 points, although they both have randomized ages, so this only represents their highest possible costs. The same is true for every other ruler in the top 10, aside from Pachacuti of Cusco, who is tied for 5th place with 28 points. And in case you think it's unfair that the rulers with randomized ages get to maximize their scores in this way, I'd just like to point out that only a few places below the top 10 we again see the rulers of Aztecs, Perm and Malwa, but at the respective minimum costs. So they're clearly pulling their weight even without optimizing their age. In general, we can see that most rulers in the top 10 have high skills and relatively low ages, but both Moctezuma and Pachacuti stand out by having slightly lower skills than you might expect, instead being compensated by their legendary conqueror personality trait, which grants a whole 10 points on its own. Next, it's time for the bottom 10 rulers. Once again, the randomized rulers will dominate the rankings, as the bottom spot is a 130-way tie between the rulers with the worst randomized stats, 000 in skills and an age of 18, giving a total score of -20. But even if we exclude the fully randomized rulers, the bottom spot still isn't far off. Tied at the bottom at -19 points are 2 rulers. The first is Henry VI of England, who despite having no randomized stats at all, still end up with skills of 000. And the second is the Ashikaga Regency under the title Bakufu, whose skills actually aren't quite as bad as the other bottom feeders, but instead they get dragged down by having no less than 3 negative personality traits. Hello, Sarxos from the future here. I just need to interrupt real quick here because literally as I was uploading this video to YouTube, I discovered I had made a small mistake while calculating the score for the Ashikaga Regency. Specifically, I had given them a much larger age multiplier than they actually ought to have. So in reality, their score should be closer to -11, thus making them tied with the rulers of Ming and Kanem Bornu, and making Henry of England untied at the bottom spot. I'm way too burnt out on this project by now to fully re-edit this part of the video, so I'm just including this little intermission instead. Sorry about that. Now back to our regularly scheduled programming. Both the Bakufu Regency and the 3rd place contender, Banvar of Jaisalmer, have randomized ages, and these bottom spots of course represent their costs at their cheapest possible age. But interestingly enough, the very next spot on the list is also Banvar of Jaisalmer, this time at his most expensive age. Of course, being the ruler of a monarchy, his possible age span only varies by 3 years, so the difference was never expected to be huge. Of the remaining bottom 10 rulers, the one who stands out the most is Yoshitake of Shiba, who only has a slightly below average sum of skills at 6, which isn't too bad, but his personality traits contribute a combined -4, which gets massively amplified due to his ripe old age of 9, which is the youngest out of any ruler in the game, resulting in a total cost of -13. Unsurprisingly, all of the bottom 10 rulers have negative costs. Now that we're done rulers, we might as well do heirs and consorts too while we're at it. The top 10 heirs can be seen here, with Tupac Yupanqui of Cusco topping the list at 42 points, a whole 20 points ahead of second place. Tupac has got some great skills, and his one personality trait does a fair bit of lifting too. Then of course it helps that he's literally newborn and thus has the highest age multiplier that an heir can possibly have, which is 2. Nobody else really comes close, because it's generally very rare for heirs to have both great skills and a very young age, and personality traits are sparse as well. The top list for consorts is far less varied, mainly because consort cost isn't affected by age and is instead always multiplied by 0.25 in the end. At the top of the list we have Marie, the consort in France, with 4 points. In terms of skills, she is tied with the second and third place contenders, but she comes out on top thanks to being the only consort with a positive personality trait, which is worth 2 points. Further down the list there exist 2 consorts with negative traits, but beyond that it's entirely decided by skills. But if we compare the skills of these consorts with their total cost, we see something weird. There are 4 consorts tied for second place with a cost of 3 points, but their sum of skills vary between being worth 10 and 12 points. So why do they all get the same final cost? The answer has to do with rounding. For rulers, heirs and consorts, their final cost always gets rounded to the nearest whole number. In the case of rulers and heirs, this doesn't affect the rankings too much, since the range of costs is rather large. But since the cost of consorts is always divided by 4 in the end, they have a much smaller range of possible values. So even a single point being rounded up or down can make a big difference. Compare for example Elizabeth, the consort of Stettin, whose skills contribute 12 points, with Ismeria, the consort of Manila, whose skills are only worth 10 points. When we divide these two values by 4, Elizabeth gets a cost of 3, while Ismeria gets a cost of 2.5. But then Ismeria's cost gets rounded to the nearest whole number, which is 3. Thus they end up with the same cost despite one of them clearly being better. Going back to the other end of the spectrum, our number 1 lowest ranked heir is Charlotte, the heir to Cyprus. Her skills are not quite rock bottom, but only just barely, and the fact that she's a newborn gives her the highest possible age multiplier, resulting in a total cost of -20. The latter fact is also true for the second worst heir, Sikander of Sind, but his skills are slightly less terrible than Charlotte's, so his total cost is only -16. The other heirs in the bottom 10 follow a trend of gradually increasing skills, with only a few exceptions of heirs who have pretty terrible skills but relatively advanced ages, which mitigates things a little. Then there are the bottom consorts, who once again don't have a very high variation in costs. The bottom spot is a 3-way tie between Helen of Brunswick, Maria of Milan, and Irina of Serbia, who all sit with a sum of skills at 3 and no personality traits, resulting in a total cost of -2. The second place is also a tie between Anne of Savoy and Anna of Hesse, but interestingly enough they aren't exactly identical. Anna gets -2 cost from having a sum of skills at 5 and no personality traits, while Anne gets -2 from having a negative personality trait and a sum of skills at 6. In both cases, the 0.25 multiplier results in them having a total cost of -1 after rounding. Going further down the list, we generally see consorts with gradually increasing skills. Okay, by now we have worked our way through almost every part of the nation designer that affects the cost of a custom nation. There have been quite a lot of complicated topics to explain in order to gain a full picture of how it all works. So if you made it this far, then good job! But if you thought it would be smooth sailing from here, I'm afraid I must admit I've saved the worst for last. National ideas. If you've ever attempted to recreate a historical nation using the nation designer, it's quite likely this is where you met your first insurmountable obstacle. There are several reasons why most national idea sets can't be fully replicated, but let's first go over how national ideas work in the nation designer. A custom nation gets 10 slots to fill in their national ideas, 2 traditions, 7 regular ideas, and 1 ambition. Each of these slots can be filled with a modifier belonging to one of 3 categories, those being administrative, diplomatic, or military. Most modifiers have several levels you can switch between, usually 2 or 4. The costs of these modifiers at each of their possible levels are explicitly defined in the game files. For example, the national tax modifier has 4 levels, where level 1 costs 0, level 2 costs 3, level 3 costs 9, and level 4 costs 18. This is only the base cost, however, as the final cost of a modifier is also affected by its placement within the national ideas. Each idea slot has a certain cost multiplier, with the early ideas having a bigger multiplier than the later ones. There's also another cost penalty, which comes into play if more than 50% of all idea levels belong to the same category, with the cost of all ideas increasing by 5% for every 1% of levels above 50%. Although the levels referred to here isn't exactly the same as the actual idea levels, rather the number of levels contributed by a given modifier is 10 times the actual level divided by the maximum level of that modifier. So returning to our example with the national tax modifier, if it is set to level 3, then the amount of levels it contributes toward the administrative category is 10 times 3 divided by 4, which equals 7.5, although it actually gets rounded down to 7. So if, for example, 55% of the total levels comes from the administrative category, then the cost of all ideas will increase by 25%. The reason most historical national ideas can't be recreated in the nation designer comes down to 3 things. First, the nation designer only has room for 1 modifier per idea slot, with the exception of the traditions. But most national idea sets contain 1 or more ideas with multiple modifiers in the same slot. Second, while the nation designer allows for a very wide selection of different modifiers, there are still some that appear among the historical national ideas that are not available in the nation designer. And third, the values that each modifier can have is limited by the possible levels that the modifier can be set to, but some national ideas contain modifiers with values that don't match any of these levels. Let's go over these 3 issues in turn, and I'll explain how I dealt with them. The first problem was the easiest to solve, because while the nation designer is limited to 10 modifiers total, the rules for how the cost is affected by each modifier still works fine even if we exceed that limitation. Since each type of modifier has a defined cost, if a given national idea set contains more than 10 modifiers, we simply add on the cost of the extra modifiers as normal. This also causes no issues with the penalty for having more than 50% levels from a single category, since that's all about the relative number of levels and is thus unaffected by the absolute number. The only thing we need to be careful about is the cost multiplier for the different idea slots. Normally, each idea slot, with the exception of the traditions, can only contain 1 modifier, and thus the multiplier for that idea slot only applies to that 1 modifier. But if a national idea set has more than 1 modifier in a single slot, then we simply apply the multiplier for that slot to every modifier contained there. So in the end, this isn't difficult to deal with either. The second problem is more tricky though. If there's a modifier that doesn't exist in the nation designer, then it doesn't have any defined cost. This leaves us with the choice to either ignore those modifiers altogether, or try to approximate a cost based on similar modifiers that are represented. For this project, I decided to go for the latter option for modifiers that I felt had enough similarities to other modifiers that it didn't feel too arbitrary to compare them, while settling for the former option if there simply weren't enough similarities. Here's the list of cases where I took the latter option. Several national ideas contain modifiers to the influence gain of various estates. The nation designer does not include any influence modifiers for specific estates, but it does contain a general influence modifier which applies to all estates. It seems reasonable to me that the cost of the specific estate modifiers could be derived from this general one, but it would have to be a bit lower, since a modifier that applies to all estates would obviously be more powerful than one that applies only to a single estate. What I ended up doing was take the cost of the all estates modifier and divide it by 3 to get the cost of the single estate modifiers, since the default number of estates is 3. I applied a similar logic to national ideas that contain modifiers for the number of privilege slots of specific estates. Once again, the nation designer only has a general modifier that grants privilege slots to all estates. So again, I took the cost of that modifier and divided by 3 to get the cost of the single estate versions. Next we have the most straightforward case out of all of them, namely the leader cost modifier, which reduces the recruitment cost of both generals and admirals. This modifier does not exist in the nation designer, but what does exist are 2 separate recruitment cost modifiers, one for generals and one for admirals. Since the leader cost modifier is literally equivalent to having both the general cost and the admiral cost modifiers, its cost should naturally be the cost of the latter 2 put together. The administrative advisor cost modifier is another pretty easy one. Since administrative advisors make up exactly 1/3 of all possible advisors, it seems reasonable to me that the cost of this modifier should be 1/3 of the general advisor cost version. On the topic of advisors, there's also a modifier which reduces the cost of advisors with your ruler's religion. Now, this one is an interesting case, because there is a custom idea defined in the game files with the name custom idea same religion advisor cost, which sounds like it should refer to this very modifier, but the modifier provided by this idea is in fact global tax modifier, but with a negative value, so it would actually reduce your taxes. On top of that, it has also been commented out, so it won't appear in game. It's difficult to say whether the level costs defined for this custom idea actually represent what the developers intended this modifier to have, seeing as it's obviously bugged. But it's the best we have to go on, so I decided to use these costs either way. The modifier that reduces development cost in primary culture provinces is technically a bit weaker than the general development cost modifier, but since it's difficult to quantify exactly how much weaker it is, I figured the simplest option would be to treat them as equal. Then there's the rather interesting case of the imperial authority modifier. The game actually has 2 kinds of imperial authority modifiers, one which gives a flat bonus to the authority growth and one which gives a percentage-based bonus. Only the percentage-based one is represented in the nation designer, but since they affect the same underlying value, I think it makes sense to correlate them. Once again, it's tricky to quantify precisely how they would compare to one another on average, so again I decided to give them the same cost for equivalent values. The default value for the percentage-based modifier is plus 10%, and it seems that 0.10 is the standard value for the flat modifier, so those will be considered equivalent. Finally, there's the may recruit winged hussars modifier. There actually is a custom idea related to winged hussars in the nation designer, but it not only activates these special units, but also provides a bonus to the amount that can be recruited, that being plus 5 per level. But a few times winged hussars appear in national ideas, it only activates them, but doesn't provide any bonus to the amount. So effectively, it's like having this custom idea at level 0, which ought to have a cost of 0 as well. In other words, this idea can be treated as entirely free. Those were all the missing modifiers that I felt were similar enough to existing ones that you don't have to make any massive leaps in logic. That still leaves a number of modifiers that I don't think can be reasonably compared to any existing ones. Those are number of possible parliament issues, overextension impact modifier, ships repair while in coastal sea provinces, monthly captain's influence, coastal raiding range, artillery levels contribution to siege, monarch power tribute from tributary states, max effect of absolutism, samurai force limit, country allows Chibuxion ships, and max general fire. Instead of trying to make up designer costs from these modifiers out of thin air, I felt the better option would be to just ignore them altogether. That will unfortunately lead to some national ideas ending up with lower costs than they probably deserve, but I don't think there are any better options. As much as I've tried to remain objective in this project, that last section inevitably had to involve some subjective judgment calls on my part. I completely understand and respect if you disagree with some of those calls, and if you think you have better ideas on how to deal with those issues, then feel free to leave your suggestions in the comments. This also applies in part to the next section, where we tackle the third and final problem with national ideas, namely the cases where a modifier has a value that doesn't match any of the available levels. As mentioned earlier, the cost of a given modifier at each level is explicitly defined in the game files. This means that technically there isn't any general formula that we can simply extend to account for values that fall outside of the existing levels. I say technically though, because if you look at actual values for the existing modifiers, it becomes clear that they follow distinct patterns in most cases, and from these patterns it's not too hard to derive consistent formulas. One thing that is clearly defined in the game files is that every level of a modifier always adds the same amount of value. Thanks to this consistency, we can calculate what level any given value corresponds to, simply by dividing that value by the value per level. For the aforementioned tax modifier, this means dividing the value by 5%, so a value of 10% corresponds to level 2, and a value of 25% would correspond to level 5. This even works for values that fall in between whole levels. For example, a value of 12% would correspond to level 2.4. With this in mind, all we need is to work out a formula that gives us the cost of a modifier at any given level. This is most feasible to do for modifiers that have 4 levels, since that gives us the most data points to work with. The simplest cases are the few modifiers that have strictly linear cost patterns, like yearly professionalism, whose cost at the 4 levels is 10, 20, 30, and 40. This sequence can easily be described by the formula 10 times n, where n is the current level. With this formula, we can calculate the cost of levels that aren't explicitly defined in the game files, and it even works for non-integer levels. But most modifiers have slightly more complex cost sequences. If we again return to our example with the national tax modifier, we see that its costs at the 4 levels are 0, 3, 9, and 18. Although this isn't a linear sequence, it does seem to follow some kind of regular pattern. If you examine it a bit, you'll realize that this is a recursive sequence, where the cost of each level is equal to the cost of the previous level plus 3 times the current level minus 1. This can also be expressed as a non-recursive formula 1.5 times n minus 1, where n is the current level. You can confirm that it is correct by trying it out on some known values. At level 1, the cost is 1.5 times 1 minus 1, and since 1 minus 1 is 0, that means the final result also becomes 0. At level 2, the cost is 1.5 times 2 minus 1, or 1, which is 3, and so on. Once again, this formula lets us calculate the cost of levels that aren't explicitly defined, including non-integer levels. This particular sequence is actually quite common among the different modifiers, so this formula can be used to describe a good chunk of them. But we don't have to stop there. Another very common cost sequence is 0, 5, 15, and 30. This is in fact also a recursive sequence, which can be described by a very similar formula to the one we already looked at, namely 2.5 times n minus 1. The reason they are so similar is because they're actually special cases of a more general formula, which can be expressed as a plus b times n minus 1, where a is the base cost corresponding to the cost of the modifier at level 1, and b is a coefficient which is equal to the difference in cost between level 1 and level 2. For both of the formulas we looked at, the base cost is 0, so that just leaves the second coefficient. In the first formula, the difference between level 2 and level 1 is 3 minus 0 equals 3, and half of that is 1.5. In the second formula, the difference between level 2 and 1 is 5 minus 0 equals 5, and halved that becomes 2.5. But what's the point of working out this generalized formula? Well, the reason is that it gives us something to work with when trying to decide formulas for the modifiers that only have 2 levels. With only 2 data points, trying to work out a consistent formula becomes an increasingly arbitrary endeavor. So rather than doing pure guesswork, I think the least arbitrary thing we can do is to follow the precedent set by the 4-level modifiers and base the formulas for the 2-level modifiers on them. That's where this generalized formula comes in handy. Since you only need the costs of the first 2 levels to decide the values for the coefficients a and b, it's entirely possible to apply this to the 2-level modifiers as well. For example, the development cost modifier costs 5 points at level 1 and 30 points at level 2. That gives the base coefficient a the value 5, and the coefficient b becomes 30 minus 5 divided by 2, which equals 12.5. Thus, the whole formula for this particular modifier is 5 plus 12.5 times n minus 1, where n is the current level. The same principle can be applied to every other 2-level modifier as well, although there are some where we might want to take a different approach. If you recall, there were a few 4-level modifiers that had linear cost sequences, so there's a precedent for that too. Looking over the costs of the various 2-level modifiers, we can find a couple where the difference between level 1 and level 2 is the same as the cost at level 1 itself. Since this certainly looks like the beginning of a linear sequence, I decided to apply a linear formula in these cases. This just leaves the modifiers that only have 1 level. With only a single data point, it's literally impossible to make even an educated guess at the general formula, so we're kind of stumped here unfortunately. But as luck would have it, in the current version of the game, we can completely dodge this problem thanks to the fact that none of the single-level modifiers that appear in the regular national ideas ever come with a value that deviates from the 1 level they have in the nation designer. This might not hold true in future updates to the game, but for now we can get away with not answering this particular question. However, there is one more special case that we sadly can't dodge as easily. Earlier, I've talked about how the 4-level modifiers follow distinct patterns when it comes to their costs at different levels. That is true for every 4-level modifier except one, the cost of advisors with ruler's culture modifier. For whatever reason, this and only this modifier breaks the trend of regular patterns and instead gives us the highly irregular sequence of 0, 1, 6, and 9. That makes this the only modifier where the rate of increase for costs starts to go down after a few levels. This implies the cost would eventually start to decrease as we go to higher levels, which obviously doesn't seem right. And unfortunately, this modifier does appear in several national ideas with a value higher than level 4, so we can't simply ignore it. My rule of thumb throughout this project is that if I can't work out the designer cost of something without making a significant amount of arbitrary assumptions, then I would rather just default to the closest thing that I can know for certain. In the case of this modifier, that means setting the cost of an unknown level to be the same as for the nearest known level. For example, if this modifier appears with a value that would correspond to a level higher than 4, then I'll set the cost to the same as for level 4. Much like with the modifiers that aren't represented at all, this will result in some national ideas ending up with lower cost than they probably deserve. But again, I think it's the best we can do. Okay, we're finally done explaining national ideas. So now we can go ahead and check out the top 10 countries when measured by that metric. But before showing the full list, there is one more quirk about the cost of national ideas that is quite unintuitive, and thus I think it warrants some more explanation. To demonstrate why it's an issue, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and reveal the top 3 most expensive nations when looking at their total nation designer cost. As you could probably have guessed, one of these is Maine. but what is perhaps more surprising is that they're only number 3. So which 2 countries managed to accrue an even higher designer cost than that? Well, it's Bohemia and Bosnia. Yeah, bet you didn't see that coming. Okay, so obviously something weird is going on here. How can tiny little Bosnia end up with a higher cost than giant Maine? The explanation lies in a particular quirk with their national ideas. If you load into the game and look at their second idea called Per aspera ad astra, you can see that it gives them +1 yearly legitimacy by default, due to the fact that Bosnia starts as a monarchy. But it also has the potential to give them devotion, horde unity, republican tradition, or meritocracy, depending on their current government form. But although only one of them is active at a time, they all still count towards Bosnia's total designer cost. This adds a lot of extra cost directly, especially the republican tradition, since it's considerably more expensive than the others. But more importantly, since they're all considered administrative ideas, they also contribute a lot to the additional penalty from having too many ideas in the same category. As a result, Bosnia and any other country whose national ideas contain one of these legitimacy modifiers tend to end up with designer costs that are massively inflated compared to what you might expect. Now, you might think that this is unreasonable. Why should we count the cost of all 5 of these modifiers if only one of them is active at a time? Surely we should just count one. While that might sound sensible, if we're going to adhere strictly to the rules of the nation designer, then we actually have to count all 5 of them. That's because the nation designer doesn't include any generic legitimacy modifier. Rather, if you want to accurately recreate the situation with countries like Bosnia, where the type of modifier changes along with your government type, then you have to add each variant as a separate idea with its own separate cost. If you only add, for example, yearly legitimacy, and then your custom nation switches to a republican government form, then the modifier will simply disappear. If you wanted to get republican tradition in that situation, then you need to also add that modifier on top of the legitimacy one. That's why counting all 5 modifiers actually gives us the most accurate result. But since it's quite unintuitive, I just wanted to point it out, so you can better understand why a lot of countries seem to be more expensive than they probably ought to be. Okay, that was the last thing I wanted to explain. So without further ado, let's have a look at the top 10 countries ranked by their national ideas. As you can guess from the preceding section, the top 2 countries on this list are Bosnia and Bohemia, with Bosnia taking the number 1 spot at 995 points. The main contributor is their +4 tolerance of heretics modifier, which has a base cost of 93 even before applying the ×2 multiplier from being part of their traditions. Tolerance of heretics is a modifier that only goes up to level 2 in the nation designer, and a common theme with these 2 level modifiers is that their costs ramp up rather quickly once you start to go beyond their original maximum. The rate at which the cost increases depends on the second coefficient in the generalized formula we talked about earlier, which, if you recall, depends on the difference in cost between level 1 and level 2 of the modifier. In most 2-level modifiers, there's a rather large jump in cost between their 2 levels, which results in a rather large coefficient, which in turn results in a rather large increase in cost as we go to higher levels. Other than that, the aforementioned legitimacy modifiers also contribute a great deal, and overall Bosnia has a rather large partiality toward administrative ideas, which results in a 235% multiplier to the base cost thanks to the imbalanced categories modifier. But someone who has an even higher cost multiplier is the second place contender Bohemia, whose proportion of administrative ideas is even greater than Bosnia's, resulting in an absolutely ridiculous cost multiplier of 300%. Some of their ideas aren't cheap either, the most expensive being the +0.3 yearly republican tradition, which comes with a base cost of 60, but goes as high as 227 after applying the bonuses from being in the second idea slot and the imbalanced categories penalty. Second most expensive is the +3 tolerance of heretics, which has a base cost of 48 and a total cost of 192. Another interesting thing to note is that Bohemia happens to be one of the countries that have the infamous cost of advisors with ruler's culture modifier, and with a value of -25%, which is greater than the maximum value of -20% allowed by the nation designer. So were it not for the fact that this modifier's irregular cost pattern forces the cost down to that of level 4, Bohemia's total cost would have been even higher. The other nations in the top 10 all have ideas which include the legitimacy modifiers, which usually provide the most significant boost to their score, along with cranking up their imbalanced category multipliers. But their other ideas tend to be fairly costly as well. Now, this list only includes the national ideas of countries that exist on the map in 1444, but of course that doesn't include even close to every set of national ideas in the game. For example, it's missing the national ideas of releasable tags and formable nations, plus a few more. So in addition to the previous list, here's a more comprehensive top 10 list of all national ideas that exist in the game. As you can see, this list includes several idea sets we haven't looked at before. At the very top of the list, we have the national ideas belonging to Synthetics, an Easter egg nation inspired by Paradox's sci-fi strategy game Stellaris, which can only be spawned into the game via console commands. It's not too surprising to see these at the top, since they were purposely made to be overpowered. The main contributors are the -85% regiment cost modifier, which corresponds to an effective level of 17 and a cost of 833 after applying all cost modifiers. Then there's the -25% technology cost, which corresponds to level 5 for a modifier that originally only had 2 levels, which cranks the total cost up to 521. Then there's the really weird one, the +50% fire damage received modifier. This is a rather unique case of a modifier which is actually detrimental, and a big one at that. Normally, the fire damage received modifier is negative, going from -5% at level 1 to -20% at level 4. By previously established logic, a value of +50% would correspond to an effective level of -10. So what would be the cost of that? Well, all we have to do is plug -10 into the cost formula for this modifier. That gives us the calculation 2.5 times -10 times -11, which equals 275. Yes, even though this modifier is entirely detrimental, it still incurs a positive cost. That's because the calculation involves the multiplication of two negative numbers, which results in a positive number. After applying all cost multipliers, this modifier contributes a full 561 points to the cost. Now, it's easy enough to argue that the formula was obviously not designed with negative levels in mind, and so this result should not be considered correct. A simple fix could be to say that if a modifier happens to have a negative level, then we simply flip the sign of the final result to a negative value as well. So in this case, we say that the final cost would be -561 instead of +561. In that case, the Synthetics national ideas would have a total cost of only 1072, bringing it down a full 2 places on the rankings. You can decide for yourself which of these two results you think is the most legit. Fortunately, the Synthetics ideas are the only national ideas in the entire game that contain modifiers with negative levels, so this is the only place where it has any impact on the result. The second candidate for the number 1 spot is the Holy Roman Empire ideas. These ideas also seem to be purposely overpowered, with many of the modifiers having larger than average values, and some even having values higher than the nation designer normally allows. The biggest contributor though is, as is often the case, the legitimacy modifiers. But in the case of the HRE, this effect is even greater than normal, since the values are about 50% higher than they usually are, effectively adding another level on top of each of them. The United States ideas also have legitimacy modifiers, but in their case, the greatest contributor is actually the massive +5 tolerance of heretics in their first idea. Looking over the others in the top 10, we can see that every single one of them have legitimacy modifiers, and their ideas are generally strong overall. What most of them also have are large multipliers from having too many ideas from the same category, often about 2 and sometimes as much as 3. That just goes to show how much that multiplier can impact the result. With the top ranked national ideas out of the way, let us now dive back into the abyss. Looking at the bottom 10 countries in regards to their national ideas, you'll find they have suspiciously similar scores to one another. This, of course, is because most of them share the same set of ideas. The bottom 7 all have the Congolese group ideas, while the following 2 have the German group ideas. The only unique idea set in this bunch is the national ideas of Kangra, which then becomes the lowest ranked unique ideas in the game. Again though, these are just the national ideas belonging to countries that exist in 1444. If we include all national ideas that exist in the game, then the Congolese ideas only place second from the bottom. The national ideas that occupy the very bottom should probably not come as a surprise to anyone. The generic ideas. While we've seen some purposefully overpowered ideas at the top, this gives an example of the opposite, as most modifiers in the generic ideas are purposefully underpowered. The only modifiers here that cost more than 0 points are the traditions and the ambition, while all the rest match level 1 modifiers from the nation designer and thus cost nothing at all. Or actually, it's worse than that. Idea number 5, Peasant Levy, has a value that is even lower than level 1, since the national manpower modifier at level 1 has a value of 7.5%, but here it's only at 5%. Its effective level is thus lower than 1, which means its cost becomes negative, being worth -1 points. This is not the only instance of a modifier being lower than level 1, but it is pretty rare. The other ideas on the list are just generally weak ones, and most of them also have very small or non-existent multipliers from too many ideas of the same category. In fact, the generic ideas have the largest imbalanced category multiplier of the lot, and even that is only at 1.89. Alright, those were all the rankings related to national ideas. And you know what that means? We've finally worked our way through every individual part of the nation designer, which means the only thing that's left is bringing it all together to look at the total combined designer cost. And for this section of the video, I have more to show off than just simple lists, namely a map. For this map, I have colored each country based on which difficulty setting you would have to use for that country to be valid as a custom nation. This ranges from countries that cost less than 50 points and would thus be valid even at a very hard setting to countries that cost more than 800 points and thus wouldn't be valid even at the very easy setting. Of course, I've already spoiled the top 3, those being Bohemia, Bosnia and Ming. But as you can see, there are several more countries that fall within the invalid category as well. In order, those are Huluf, Sweden, Augsburg, Athens and Venice, although Venice only joined this group in the latest patch. You might recognize several of these countries from the top 10 list for national ideas, which should demonstrate just how significant a country's ideas can be for their total cost. Out of all the countries at the top, only Ming gets the bulk of their points from the provinces, while national ideas make up more than 3/4 of the total cost for everyone else, and usually significantly more. But it's clearly not the only relevant factor, as the order of nations in this list is slightly different from the list for national ideas. Bosnia actually has significantly more expensive national ideas compared to Bohemia, but Bohemia makes up for it with their more expensive provinces. Meanwhile, Athens has more expensive ideas than Augsburg, but Augsburg still comes out on top overall, mostly thanks to having a capital in the HRE, which gives them a flat plus 20 points that Athens lacks. If we now instead look at the other end of the spectrum, you might be wondering if there even are any nations that fall within the very hard category. And yes, there is. Exactly one. Right here. The small northern Indian state of Kangra has a cost no higher than 48, making them the only country to fall below the 50-point threshold. If you recall, Kangra already featured on the list of the bottom 10 countries by national ideas, which goes a long way to explain why their overall cost is so low. But they only came in at number 10 on that list, so how did they end up at the very bottom here? Well, in addition to their national ideas, they also have a rather shitty ruler, with a cost of -5 or -6 depending on randomized age, and their government rank is duchy, which is another -10 points. Finally, the cost of their one and only province just barely exceeds 2 points. No other country has managed to accumulate quite so many subpar things all at once, which is why Kangra gets the unique distinction of being the only very hard country out of the historical ones. The other countries near the bottom also share some of the cheapest national ideas, along with typically mediocre rulers and poor provinces. On this map you may also have noticed that there are some striped countries. These are countries whose rulers are partially or entirely randomized, and depending on what stats the ruler happens to get, they may end up in one category or another. This is a very common occurrence among, for example, the North American natives, as you can see. That's because their starting rulers are all native councils, which are designated as regions. And as I said in the part about rulers, native governments that start with regions always get completely randomized rulers upon game start. This results in a potential swing of 60 points between the best and worst possible rulers, so any native country that happens to lie relatively close to the threshold between two categories can easily end up in either one or the other. I want to make it clear though that it's not just the striped countries that have randomized rulers. In fact, the majority of countries have rulers with at least randomized ages, and sometimes also randomized skills. It's just that in most cases they don't lie close enough to a category threshold so that the randomized ruler ends up making the difference. So far we've only looked at a map of the different difficulties that each country falls under, but of course that doesn't give a terribly detailed picture of the difference between countries within a category, especially in the easy and very easy categories that have very large ranges. In case you'd want a slightly more granular categorization, I've also made this alternative map with more categories, and where each category is a consistent 100 points. I won't talk too much over this map though, I'm just showing it off for those who want to have a closer look. Alright, I don't think there's much else to talk about really. Or well, there could be a ton more to talk about if I really wanted to, given the sheer amount of data I have. But at this point it's probably easier for those interested to just look at the results themselves. In the description I'll link to both of the maps I just showed, and also to a bunch of spreadsheets containing data about every single nation, national idea, province, ruler, and more. Now, if you happen to be interested in looking at the code I wrote for this project, then I must unfortunately admit that I no longer have it. A while after I produced my initial batch of results and started working on this video, my computer fried itself and I lost a good part of the contents on my hard drive, including all the code I had written for this project. Fortunately, the results themselves were intact, so the whole project wasn't doomed, but it nonetheless means I'm unable to show off any of the code or to produce any more data than what I already have. And yes, I know I should have made backups or utilized a GitHub repository or something similar, but hindsight is 2020, so I'll just have to treat this as a learning experience. At least this means I won't have to be embarrassed about the hot mess the code ended up being in the end, so it ain't all bad. Okay, that is all. This video ended up way longer than I had originally envisioned, but I hope you've enjoyed it nonetheless. Goodbye for now, and have a great time of day.